Um, so good morning again, and then just a word to my previous speaker. I called Susan the, I've never told her this, but the great organizer of behavior change science, and you could begin to tell why. And I think her work has been very, very helpful in, as I've written somewhere, and I think I deleted it afterwards, getting our act together when we do research in health behavior change. So within that framework, I will focus on a particular perspective, self-determination theory, which you've heard about before. My first connection with this theory was during the course of my PhD work, where I did a review of predictors of weight loss. And at that moment, I came across this variables of autonomy, of self-motivation, of autonomy support. Some of them were actually reasonably consistent predictors of weight loss, and I didn't know what to do with this concept, so I went to study them. This was a bit before the publication actually came out. I looked for a book which I found explaining self-motivation by what I later realized was the author, or one of the authors, the founding fathers of self-determination theory. So that's how I got involved in this particular perspective. At the same time, I was doing a weight loss intervention in Arizona, and this was a 4-month intervention with a 12-month follow-up via the internet, so it was really a 4-month intervention. And during the course of some analysis, actually some secondary analysis that we did, we came across groups that had very different profiles of success within this intervention. And we found post-hoc, I should say, in this analysis, that people that displayed high levels or the highest levels of intrinsic motivation for exercise at the end of the intervention actually came up with the best results in the long term. So that drove me to explore this topic a bit further. And just by looking at the measure, the intrinsic motivation inventory that we looked at, I started to get a good sense of what I was going after. If we look at the measure, which has these 4 dimensions, and later an extra dimension of perceived choice was actually included as well, and you can start looking more carefully, you see things like competence and choice. And these are critical elements of something that I later understood, this concept of autonomous motivation, which I'll explain a bit further. And this is actually the leading or the guiding principle or the guiding concept behind or within self-determination theory. Usually it has to do with the importance that we attribute to something that we value, something that we seek, something that we are motivated to pursue, and it also can be related to feelings of enjoyment in that task. So interest, enjoyment, and importance are fundamental for autonomous motivation, and usually expresses itself as I said, interest, as a commitment, investment, and effort, and the absence of pressure, so a sense of choicefulness and freedom about this particular action. So this was my start with this concept that I later started studying with more detail. So today, I will give you a brief overview of this theory and some of its premises, a brief review of some of the application in health behavior change, and I emphasize brief and summary because this is something that we can all look and explore, and then I will end with some reflections on the present, the future, and some of the limitations of this particular perspective as well. SDT is a broad theory of motivation, and it has been around for a long time. Actually, it wasn't very popular. Actually, motivation wasn't very popular in psychology for quite some time in recent decades, although it has been developed, SDT has been developed throughout that period. And it has been applied to very different areas, and you see some of those highlighted there. I think it's actually very unique in the sense that it has been applied to such diverse set of applications. And these include the ones that I will be focusing today on: physical activity, health, eating / obesity. It involves the study of, it includes several mini theories, which I will not explain in any detail today, but just to give you a sense of its potential complexity or comprehensiveness. However, as another expert in SDT, another not comparing to me, but with DC and Ryan, I should say, has put, although the puzzle might seem complex, it actually, when you understand the basic premises of it, the basic concepts, it is marked by a certain parsimony and also elegance that allows you to apply those principles to a wide variety of contexts. And that's something that also attracts me in this particular perspective. It actually it can be applied to our day-to-day lives and to our day-to-day settings in very intuitive ways. Let me start with some sort of more philosophical assumptions or principles that are sometimes not discussed sufficiently when we think about psychological theories or behavior change theories. And SCT has a few assumptions. There's a certain view on human nature and on human functioning that informs the way the theory then develops. And we often don't talk about these things, and you don't see them written in papers that briefly address this particular theory. One of them is that humans have this agency, this innate desire to explore and to be active within their environments. And unlike being entirely dependent on external input, people actively seek and explore their environment in ways that are innate, that are inborn. And you can look at children also often as a good example of this innate tendency to explore and to be effective in our environment. SCT also assumes that people have this growth and integrative tendencies. And this comes from a humanistic perspective on humans in general, and that it's somewhat of a positive view of human nature, that we have this tendency to grow, to develop throughout life, and to integrate what we learn and what we see into something that is coherent within what we already bring into that system. And this process is called the internalization process, by which you adopt certain inputs from the environment and make them your own. So they become part of your own structure. And however, SCT is not just an organismic theory in the sense that there's an organism developing, but it's developing in close relationship with its environment, which can either support or thwart the development of this human organism. So social input and social environments are very important. So this is called an organismic dialectical theory, because it involves principles about the development of the organism, but also a constant dialectical relationship with the environment, which can be both positive and or negative. Now, SCT differentiates between different types of motivation. It's one of its unique features. There's many ways in which it can be differentiated. I will synthesize it by looking at the two major components, or the two major distinctions, and it's probably the most functional distinction, the most important to focus on. And that's this distinction between autonomous and controlled forms of motivation. Now, what does it mean to be autonomous? In simple terms, it means to act in a self-endorsed way. It means that you feel wholeheartedly, that you feel whole when participating in a given activity or one defining a certain goal. SCT researchers sometimes use this expression of an authorship emotion, or ownership over the emotion, in which you are fully committed with the choice that you've made. You are whole behind it, and that's a simple way to describe this aspect of one's motivation, and it's associated typically with feelings of freedom in choosing. It's actually the perception that you have choice, not the fact that you may have multiple choices. You may have multiple choices, but feel not choiceful, feel that you cannot make those choices. On the contrary, you can have very few choices, but you can feel that whatever the decision might be, you were the one that made that decision. A sense of freedom, if you like, in choosing your course. What autonomy is not, and it's important to distinguish, first of all, because many people think of autonomy as doing things independently, as doing things on your own. And in the dictionary, you may find those types of definitions. Autonomy is not something you desire, and I'm speaking on behalf of self-determination theory in this case. It's not something you want to achieve or you want to have. It's also not something that you constantly think of. It's not part of our conversation. Many times we're not conscious and we're not fluent about our levels of autonomy, even though it's in the works. It's also not a preference or a trait, even though there is some sort of there are some individual differences about people functioning more or less autonomously. It's something that we all need. That it's something that it's necessary. It's a necessary condition for all human beings to thrive. And finally, as I said, it's not the same as self-reliance, there are multiple studies that have shown that in different types of societies, more collectivistic, more individualistic, the same principles, the same relationships between autonomy and well-being, or between autonomy and behavior, are the same. And so, in a sense, it is proposed to be a universal aspect. I will skip over some of the philosophical antecedents or ramifications of this construct that goes back a long way. I like this idea of authenticity. As I said, this authorship aspect of one's actions. I think it helps inform, or it helps think about this perception, this feeling of feeling autonomous. On the opposite side, you have controlled motivation. And controlled motivation is when you feel pressured. And this pressure can come from actually, it always comes from the external environment in one form or another. Sometimes it only comes from the external environment in the source of seductions or threats or punishments or incentives. Sometimes it comes from things that we've internalized from the environment but have not, or accepted from the environment, but have not fully made our own. And so we think that we should do some action. We feel like we must do something, but we are ambivalent about it. We're not fully and wholeheartedly involved in that particular activity. And Martin van Stikist used an interesting expression to talk about as mustivation. And I think you can understand where he's getting from this sense of not being a true choice. It's something I must or ought to do. Now, an important second set of ideas is that there are different correlates. So these different types of motivation have different consequences. And dozens of studies have shown that the consequences differ in terms of affect, in terms of behavior, and also in terms of well-being. And in terms of behavior, and for the purpose of behavior change thinking, usually you see more consistent behavior pursuits when people are autonomously motivated, and also a higher level of engagement, of commitment, and investment in a given activity. On the contrary, several studies show, or actually many studies show, that behavioral engagement seems to be less consistent, more superficial, and also actually dependent on external contingencies when you are controlledly motivated. You can also be inclined to take the path of least resistance to achieve a certain goal, because it's a means to an end. You're more concerned about the outcome than the actual process. You're not fully engaged and involved with this activity. A third set of constructs, the last one, is the idea that well, interventions and any sort of intervention can be designed to be promoting of autonomous motivation. And it does so by satisfying these three fundamental needs. I've mentioned autonomy, and I'll add competence, which is a very common construct, as it was said before in psychology, but also this aspect of having meaningful, satisfying relationships with others. And I give you the examples of items from those scales in the context of exercise. I feel free to exercise in my own way. And I guess you understand what this is getting at. I feel capable to overcome challenges, and I feel close to my exercise companions. And these are some of my exercise companions, and I can assure you that for the most part, we are very autonomously motivated, and these are the markers of that autonomous motivation. And theory would say that we would be more persistent, more involved in that activity, more creative in it, more resourceful in it, but also more derive more satisfaction and well-being from participating in this activity with this motivational profile that I'm highlighting here. So to synthesize the scheme of it, there's these two great major types of motivation that have different consequences, different outcomes. Interventions, and any intervention, from a parent's advice to a policy measure, can include these factors in mind in their targets, and you do so by satisfying or by targeting these three constructs, these three fundamental mechanisms underlying one's motivational quality. There are other aspects. I've just touched upon three of the mini theories, but there are other aspects of the theory which I will not cover. I'm actually very interested in, and think the idea behind goals and the contents of goals, we slightly touched upon that before, is one that it's very relevant for health behavior change. And I should say, I will just say that in self-determination theory, goals are not created equal in the sense that they have different potentials to satisfy people's basic psychological needs, and consequently to have different implications for behavior persistent for behavior engagement and involvement. And we've made some addition here just as a joke in terms of meaningful to add to these SMART goals. Not just smart and adequate, but also meaningful to the person. But I won't explore that further. STT has a wide set of instruments that are available to measure its constructs. Actually, David Martin is a world expert on exercise motivation measures. He has a great website with resources. The STT website also have a large set of resources. All these measures are publicly available. And the STT website also has many, if not all, of the papers that are constantly being published in trying to explore this particular perspective of motivation. And I've just highlighted a few days ago how many papers are available in the areas of sport, exercise, and physical education, and in the areas of healthcare by the latest accounts. So I'll try to summarize some of this in the next 3 minutes or so, looking especially at quite the daunting task, but looking, the shortcut that I'll take is I'll use systematic reviews or meta-analyses that are available just to give you a flavor for the level of evidence where we are and the quality of it, where we are in trying to apply STT to health, exercise, diet, and obesity. We've reviewed the evidence on weight control. I'll start with weight control a few years ago, and actually these were how many studies were available in 2012. Not that many to derive firm conclusions from. And that's all I'll say at the point in 2012, although the evidence was supportive, and I could show you a study an early study by Jeff Williams. There was also an interesting study later on focusing on weight loss maintenance that was also supportive of autonomous motivation being predictive of long-term weight control-related outcomes. I won't dwell on it. And I'll show you briefly what I still think is perhaps the most in-depth application of STT to the context of weight control, which we conducted here a few years ago. We designed a one-year intervention explicitly based on STT, although if we did it today, probably we would do it a little differently and better, but this is already a few years ago. And we followed people up for 2 years. We have some main results for weight, some supportive indications that our main outcome, even though this is not a behavior, and I think Susan would get on my case quite quickly that this is not a behavior, but it's an expression of different behaviors, all related in terms of main outcomes from this theory-based intervention. Perhaps most importantly, we looked at mediation effects from some of the key constructs of STT, in this case, exercise autonomous motivation as predictor of behavior and weight control with generally supportive findings. It's just one study. More studies are needed, but this is one that Marlene Silva published in the course of her dissertation work that is perhaps perhaps the best evidence we have for a mediating role of STT-related variables. More recently, we actually did a more exploratory analysis of a larger list of variables that we had on hand, and we did the same analysis, but looking just at one-year variables predicting 3-year outcomes, a very exploratory and post-hoc analysis, but interestingly, or not, because of course it's the same data set, but other variables could have popped up as stronger predictors, but again, using a signal detection methodology in this case, Inez and Utamata and some of us looked at the variables that best differentiated successful from unsuccessful losers, and autonomous motivation came up as the single best predictor, followed by exercise perceived barriers. I'll jump over this one. It's a more recent study, also showing some post-hoc supportive relationships between autonomous motivation and weight loss. Moving on to exercise, we also conducted a systematic review a couple of years ago. There's a little bit more evidence, although most of it is cross-sectional. Generally, to synthesize, the evidence is relatively supportive, or actually very consistently supportive of a relationship between quality of motivation and level of physical activity. And that's all I'll say, minutes of physical activity if you'd like. We conducted a recent search just a few weeks ago just to see where we were in terms of interventions that were STT-based and how good were they in terms of informing us of its usefulness. Just to synthesize as well, we found 7 studies, 13 papers, 7 studies only, and from those 7 were able to change the STT-based mediators. Actually, there were a few very poor studies in the mix, which we could comment at length, but I will not dwell on it now, just to get an overview of the level of evidence. How well it changed behaviors. These are some of the categories that Susan alluded to before in terms of the theory coding scheme and what they report. Were they able to change behavior? The same 7 studies did. And were they supportive? There was evidence that was supportive of the theory model in one way or another, and 8 of those studies were. So not a lot of evidence. Not a lot of good evidence, but generally supportive and certainly encouraging further research. There's actually very nice studies within this pack as well, and this is the pack study coming from Michel's Fortier group. We have a really nice job in detailing the intervention techniques, how they relate to the fundamental principles, and how they are expected to predict change. Diet, not much out there. We reviewed this recently, and there's actually not enough data to derive conclusions about mediating effects of motivation on dietary behaviors. A few single studies, post-hoc, in this case, we did an analysis. UTMATA conducted a post-hoc analysis looking at predictors of eating regulation in the context of our PISO study, and we saw some relationships, some mediating role, in this case related to exercise, but also in relation to the intervention. And there is at least one RCT that explicitly was based on STT and also social cognitive theory in this case, and that look at the mediation model for fruit and vegetable intake in a large number of adults, and found that autonomous motivation was both mediator and moderator of fruit and vegetable intake. There's other studies in smoking. There's a few other studies, actually a very good study in dental care, so other areas of health that I could also, if I had time, I'll also go to, but I'll just synthesize this part, the evidence part, to say that I think there is consistent cross-sectional evidence at this point, particularly for exercise and physical activity, growing for other areas, limited experimental evidence, although largely it is supportive, and some supportive mediation studies, but we definitely need a lot more. Studies also seem to be consistent across areas and across study types, and I'm encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of new research in the pipeline with better studies being described. This is just two examples of studies that are being designed. These are the protocol papers, and it's very important that people publish their protocol papers so that we know exactly what they're doing. In this case, these are just two examples of STT-based interventions there, whose results, that will have results, I think, fairly soon. So what, just to finish up the next few minutes, what does self-determination theory, in my perspective, offer to the field of health behavior change that it's perhaps most unique, besides the evidence and, of course, besides the unquestionable commitment to the scientific process and to testing these ideas in the adopted and peer-reviewed scientific manner. Well, this qualitative analysis of motivational process, I think it's very useful and unique, and I try to explain briefly and also give some evidence for it, but also moving into quality of behavior, and I'll touch upon that in a second a bit more. Not just quality of motivation, but quality of behavior. Notice that many of the studies I showed, for instance, in exercise, the outcome was just minutes of physical activity. I think that's very, very limited in terms of value from the consequences of the behavior and the experiences of the behavior, and also in terms of public health impact. And I'll explain that in a moment. It also presents a rationale for long-lasting motivation, which not many theories or many theories do not address, although some do. And this internalization process by which we make we make motivation our own, we integrate it into our values, and then it becomes the principle and the basis through which we develop goals and actions. So we internalize the regulation of the behavior, and that provides, I think, a very interesting theoretical perspective to explain how behaviors are maintained throughout time. It also addresses the issue of psychological energy, which is one that it doesn't come up quite often. I actually wanted to ask about it before, because many times it seems like the problem is about having the energy. Claudia mentioned about courage to be able to change, or commitment to change. Sometimes we hear about willpower or determination. I think all of that, within all of that, is this idea that sometimes we feel energetic and vital about our goals, sometimes we don't. What are the antecedents? What are the predictors of that energy? And although I won't explore it at length, STT provides an interesting model to explore why we sometimes feel very energetic and vital and willing to pursue our goals, and sometimes we feel more passive and less energetic. And for instance, for self-control actions, this may be relevant, as I'll touch upon. And finally, it provides an account for this idea of autonomy, which is really the central focus of the theory. It's also its most controversial. Some theoreticians, some psychologists say that there's no such thing. You can't isolate autonomy in a social world and so forth. I try to explain how perhaps, for instance, confusing it with independence is a very common aspect. And as I hope have understood, it's not about independence. It's about how you perceive your own role in the actions that you choose. And in biomedical ethics, for instance, this is a very important construct. So it's important that behavior change interventions at least think about this concept of autonomy, which by biomedical ethics guidelines, we must focus on patient feeling choiceful and volitional about the courses of action that, for instance, in the consult, they are inclined to do. Some limitations to finish and some open questions as well. I think there are measurement issues to progress, to improve in terms of STT. And some of this has to do with the fact that the construct, especially this construct of autonomy, it's not a cognition in the sense that people are not used to think about it. It's more about the human the experience of it, the phenomenology of it. And that's not easily accessed by typical questionnaires. We can improve. There's many ways to improve it. Explicit measures might be, or implicit measures might be one of them. But just to keep it as an open issue, that we think that STT can improve in terms of its methodology for its key, for its key constructs. Also, we need a clear definition of an organization of its intervention elements, its facets, its techniques, and you'll hear more about this later. And I agree with what was said before. I think context, specificity, it's important for any theory, for any intervention, and it's not exception in STT. And I think, for instance, behaviors that are mandatory in the sense of you choosing to do it, but also you accept a certain level of external input, such as when you work for money, comparing with leisure activities which are fully within your control, things might apply a bit differently. Some of the constructs might have subtle differences. Also, the role of incentives are also a very important area of research. And also behavior specificity. Things might be a little different depending on the types of behavior. And physical exercise, for instance, might be very different from a behavior like smoking or from a one-off behavior such as taking an examination, for instance. Things might apply differently. And I'm just opening up this idea for exploration perhaps in the discussion. Some more perhaps deeper level open questions. One idea is that motivation is, the way STT motivation is defined is perhaps a bit distal from day-to-day behaviors, and there's many factors that stand in the place. STT motivation deals with things like meaning, with things like human development and human growth, and the meaning of the experience. And that's sometimes not something that we think of many times. It also deals with our deepest interests, with our life aspirations. We're not always conscious and mindful of those aspects. And that's another question that I would ask before is, to the extent that we are, for instance, aware of our goal structures, or there's a lot of work that we can do to better realize who we are in terms of our goals and values and preferences and aspirations. So it's normal that the predictive models might not be very strong because there's a lot in the way. And of course, the environment in many different respects would account for a lot of that variation. Also, this came up earlier, the role of self-awareness, the role of self-reflection. Reflection is a very important aspect in STT. Actually, self-determined action is defined as the action that you would endorse at the highest level of reflection. Well, I'm not sure that we are that used to, or that in our day-to-day lives, or that society actually encourages to be very reflected at the higher level in a constant manner. So perhaps interventions, as was said before, have some role to play in that regard. Although STT also explores automatized behaviors that are still autonomous. So behaviors that have become automatic in your day-to-day life, but that were you to reflect on them, you would be able to decide that they are self-endorsed, that they are something that you stand by, although you're not thinking about it all the time. It's another area of exploration. And is STT truly a behavior change theory? It's perhaps the biggest question of all in the context of what we are discussing here. I think the idea that STT focuses on quality of motivation and quality of behavior and not amounts of each of them speaks to the point that perhaps the key element, the preferred outcome from an STT intervention would be self-endorsed or autonomous behavior, even if it means not behaving. So autonomous non-compliance would be an acceptable outcome from an STT-based intervention, which clashes obviously with our need, or in some cases mandate, to change behavior, for instance, to stop smoking. Well, this discussion could take us a long way, maybe it will, but I'm not sure that we could classify STT as a truly behavior change theory, even though it is very useful to understand, especially long-term behaviors. So finally, this is something that I've mentioned before, quality aspects, and I'll just list them. I've talked about these two, and there's evidence, there's studies on vitality and ego depletion as a function of autonomous or the quality of motivation, and also improved self-control, and I would refer you to the work of Mark Murven if you're interested in that, in this particular line of work, looking at how subjective vitality, this element of energy, could be a good mediator explaining how when autonomously motivated, you're more likely to and more persistent in the pursuits of your goal, even if it includes difficult behaviors or behaviors that involve a lot of effort, such as some self-control, regulatory aspects of our behavior. I'll jump, just to show you how SCT is being used in some projects. This is one that where we are using SCT to inform an intervention that will ask football fans to be more physically active for the long term. We're also using it in an Horizon 2020 project that you'll hear more about later on evidence-based tools for weight loss maintenance, and we are adapting the intervention to be able to match with the criteria that you just heard Susan Mickey refer to. And I had some final thoughts, but I'll leave them for another time, for the sake of time, and I thank you very much for your attention.